Right, hello podcast. The recording from the sermon didn't work properly, so I'm doing this again on Monday for the podcast stream. Did anybody used to watch the show CSI? Crime Scene Investigators. If you didn't watch it, it's fairly straightforward. It's like a detective cop show thing. And at the start of every episode, a bad thing would happen. And then the crime scene investigators would come in, do a load of science stuff involving swabs and exciting music, before eventually figuring out who it was that had been naughty, who'd done the naughty thing. Anyway, Jamie and I used to watch it a lot. And after a little while, I was able to work out who the killer was within pretty much the first 10 minutes of the episode. And I could do that because CSI had a clear pattern that made it easy to work out. Basically, if somebody appeared in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the show, said a line of dialogue, and then disappeared for the rest of the episode, well, that was the baddie. That was the person who did it. That's the naughty man. And I think that's the pattern they used for about 90% of the episodes that they did, and there's about 1 million episodes, I think. What they would do is they would flag the person who's going to be important in advance, so you could watch out for them and the effects of them throughout the rest of the episode. And in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, well, that verse is a bit like that random character saying a line and then disappearing into the background for a bit, because the truth is, we don't need verse 1. Verse 1 of Ruth chapter 2 is pretty redundant. It doesn't add anything to the chapter. Everything it tells us is stuff we're going to find out later on. So the question is, why is it there? Why is verse 1 in this chapter at all? And I think it's there because it's the writer of this book's flag to make us spot somebody we need to watch out for later on. It's like that baddie in CSI coming in at the start and then not appearing until later on. We need to watch out for them. Verse 1 is there as the writer's way of telling us to pay attention to Boaz when he turns up. He's going to be important. Watch out for him. And so we'll see what happens in Ruth chapter 2 as the camera follows Ruth through the 5 scenes of this particular episode in the life of Ruth. And the first scene is Naomi and Ruth in verses 2 to 3. Naomi and Ruth. You see, chapter 1, we saw last week, ended on a bit of a cliffhanger. We were really pleased that Naomi had come home with her dead son Moabite wife Ruth back to Bethlehem. But we were also nervous. So the problem is they've got nothing. And they've got no one to look after them. And in chapter 2, the camera stays on these women and begins with that same question that we ended with in chapter 1 last week. How on earth will these 2 vulnerable widows survive in a land that isn't safe for them? And just to be really clear, at the time the judges ruled, which is when the book of Ruth is set, Israel really was not a safe place for women to be. If you flip back in your Bibles a few chapters to Judges chapter 19, you will see that really clearly as a vulnerable woman is abused, violated, and murdered by Israelite men who should have been protecting her. Israel was not a safe place to be if you were a single female. So how on earth are Ruth and Naomi going to survive? Well, one thing they need is food. And it seems that Ruth has heard of a law that God gave his people back in Leviticus 19, Leviticus 23, and Deuteronomy 24. This law told God's people that when they harvested their fields, when they were collecting up everything that they'd grown in order to sell it, they had to do 2 things. First of all, they had to leave an area around the edge of the field unharvested by them. And that was so that the poor, including foreigners, could come along and collect their own food from that area. And then secondly, while they were harvesting, if they dropped any wheat or barley onto the floor, they had to leave it there. They couldn't pick it up. They mustn't pick it up. They mustn't pick up anything they dropped. And that was so that the poor could come along after and pick it up instead. That's what gleaning was. It was God's provision for the neediest in Israel. They would come along and be able to glean and pick up the stuff that the harvesters dropped. And it seems that Ruth had clearly heard that this is what God's people were meant to do. So she assumes that God's people would follow God's instructions and do it, which in itself was a bit of a risk. See, at this time, God's people largely ignored God's laws. They all did what they thought was right, not what God said was right. So as Ruth leaves the house, the question we've got is, what is she going to find as she goes out there? And as an aside, this is a challenge to all of us if we're Christians. Do we obey what God tells us to do? You may have heard the old line of, you might be the only Bible a non-Christian ever reads. And that's sometimes true. So what kind of Bible do they read in our lives? If they were to read our lives and then read an actual Bible, would the two line up? What are we most known for as Christians? For honesty, truth, kindness, gentleness, love, patience, a commitment to each other? Or is it snarkiness and gossip and backstabbing and grumpiness? You see, we need to obey God when he gives us commands in his word. It's part of his good plan for our witness to the world. So we need to do it, both individually and as a church family. How are we representing God to the world around us? Anyway, in verse 3, Ruth leaves home with Naomi and, as luck would have it, she just happens to go to the field owned by Boaz, this guy that the writer flagged in verse 1. Oh, what luck! Which is where scene 2 happens, where we see Boaz and the men in verses 4 to 7. See, as Ruth is working there, Boaz, the owner of this field, just happens to turn up. What are the chances of that happening? Oh, what luck! And we're meant to pay attention here. See, this is our chance to see what he's like. Is he going to be different to everyone else in Israel at the time? Or is he going to be just like them, doing what he thinks is right and being fairly horrible? Well, the first words out of his mouth tell us. Verse 4, he says, "The Lord be with you." Now that word Lord, you may have spotted it, is all in capital letters. And that's because in the original Hebrew, which is the language Ruth was written in, it's the special name that God gave for only his people to use. And whenever that name's used in the Old Testament, you'll see it in these capital letters. It reminds us of the covenant and the promises, the special promises that God made only to his people. They were the only ones who were allowed to use this name. And so that whenever you see it in the Old Testament, it will be in capital letters like this, Lord. And it's the first thing we hear Boaz saying, a covenant blessing to the people. And they give it back to him. And as he stood there, Boaz notices a new woman gleaning in the field. So he asks his foreman all about her, and he learns how hard she's been working that morning up until now. And as a reader, there's meant to be more tension here. So the problem with Ruth is that we know this story really well. So we know what Boaz is like, a lot of us. But if you were the original readers, there's tension. How is Boaz going to act here? Yeah, he treats his working men well, but how's he going to treat this vulnerable foreign widow? Is he going to practice what he claims to believe? Or will he act like everyone else in these days and abuse this vulnerable widow for his own benefit? We are meant to feel nervous as he walks towards Ruth in verse 8, which is where the third scene happens, Boaz and Ruth. And that begins in verse 8 to verse 14. And you can imagine as this scene starts, Ruth's nerves. The rich Israelite man whose field I'm working in is coming over to talk to me. What will he want? What's he going to want me to do? Am I safe? Is he going to take all this food that I've collected off me for himself? Is he going to look after me? And you can hear her heart beating in her throat, and you can see the sweat form on her forehead. What's going to happen? Well, if she was nervous, Boaz quickly calms her nerves. Verse 8, Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." The first thing he calls Ruth is my daughter. Now, this doesn't mean Ruth is actually his daughter. She's a Moabite and he's an Israelite. But he calls her my daughter as his way of showing that he's going to protect her like somebody would their own daughter. And it also shows that Boaz is probably a bit older than Ruth too. So he treats her like a younger sister or a daughter. Someone he's going to protect and not abuse. And can you imagine Ruth's relief? He even tells Ruth to stay and work in his field, but not even on her own anymore. She gets the protection of working alongside Boaz's working women. He protects and he cares for her. And he carries this on in verse 9. He tells her that he's told his men to not even touch her. Clearly showing that they needed to be told that, reflecting what Israel was like in those days. You see, Boaz can't guarantee her safety elsewhere in Israel, but in this field, he can. And he protects her. And she can even now drink from the water Boaz has collected just for his work party to drink. She hasn't got to stay thirsty or wander off on her own to get some water. She gets to drink the water he provides for them. This is next level generosity from Boaz. This is above and beyond what God's law requires him to do, especially to a foreigner and especially to a Moabite. And Ruth knows it, which is why, verse 10, she bows down in front of him in thanks and asks him why he's doing all this for her at all. She knows she deserves nothing. Who she is in Israel at this time, she's entitled to scraps, but she's being given a feast. Well, Boaz tells her why, verse 11 and 12. Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. He's heard about and seen Ruth's ruthfulness towards Naomi, her love and commitment to her. And he knows that that is really the result of her love and trust of Naomi's God, the covenant God of his people. You see, Boaz knows Ruth hasn't only come to Bethlehem for her mother-in-law. She's come to Bethlehem to find safety and salvation under the wings of Bethlehem's covenant God. She's come in the faith that God's grace can go to even her, a foreigner. And so Boaz welcomes Ruth as an equal, not an outsider. His faith in God leads to over-the-top generosity towards Ruth. But it doesn't stop there. You see, in verse 14, at the mealtime, he welcomes Ruth to come and eat with him and his men in a full welcome into his circle, fully accepted. Eating with someone in those days in Israel was a massive deal. Do you remember Jesus? People are outraged at Jesus eating with such horrible people because eating was such a sign of intimacy and acceptance and welcome. And here Boaz welcomes Ruth to eat with him. He even gives her some of his own food, bread, wine, vinegar, and roasted grain. And Ruth eats, not just a little bit. She eats till she's satisfied. She's full up. You see, Boaz's faith in the covenant, promise-keeping God of his people is shown in his over-the-top abundant generosity to the neediest, most undeserving person that he meets. But that doesn't even stop when Ruth goes out of earshot. In scene 4, Boaz and the men, again, in verses 15 to 16, as Ruth walks off camera, Boaz turns to his men. So far, they've been told to keep Ruth safe. Now, though, they're told to do even more. As we saw earlier, normally if they dropped some wheat or barley while harvesting, God's law said they had to leave it on the floor for the poor to pick up. Boaz, however, tells his men to deliberately pull out stalks and leave them around for her. On top of that, he tells them to let Ruth now go places she usually shouldn't. She gets to glean among the sheaves that they finished collecting and gathering together and piled up. She gets to look among them for any bits of grain that she can take home. Ruth is given access to every bit of the harvest field. Nothing held back. Do you see how remarkable this is? How generous this is? And be clear, this generosity is going to cost Boaz. Everything Ruth picks up is stuff he doesn't get. It's stuff he can't sell and can't eat himself. Boaz's generosity means that he misses out and he makes less money. He suffers as a result of his kindness to her, and yet he still does it. His faith in God frees him to be this generous. And just how generous he's been, we see in scene 5, which is Naomi and Ruth again, in verses 17 to 23. See, at the end of the day, Ruth threshes the barley she's collected to get rid of the waste, and when she weighs it all up, she has about an ephah of barley to take home. That's not my daughter ephah. That is an ephah spelt differently. Now, in modern weight, that's probably about 30 pounds, 13 kilograms, if that helps you, from one day's work, by hand. That is loads. If you're struggling to picture how much it is, this is the same weight as 4,000 tea bags, or nearly 130 blueberry muffins, or 19 iPads, or 166,667 bees, apparently. But however you compare it, this is a lot. And somehow, Ruth drags this all home. She's clearly hench. And you can imagine Naomi's reaction in verse 18. She said goodbye to Ruth in the morning with nothing, and Ruth turns up at the end of the day with all of this. It is no wonder she bursts out in verse 19 with, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And I love how the author drags out Ruth's answer for the final reveal in verse 19. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she'd been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she says. Oh, and you can hear the music swell as the camera focuses on Naomi's reaction to this news. Boaz! Of course! She'd forgotten all about Boaz. And yet the mention of his name reminds Naomi that she hasn't returned empty, as she complained about in chapter 1. Oh, she's come back to the protection God promised her all along. You see, Boaz is a close relative of her dead husband's, one of their guardian redeemers. Now, a guardian redeemer means that he's someone who, through God's law, it was his job to protect and look after Elimelech's family if he dies. A guardian redeemer's job was to look after the family and property of their relative if that relative died. And Naomi had forgotten about him till now. And yet the random chance happenings of that day have brought Ruth randomly into contact with him, of all people. And even better, he's a good man. He's a kind man, a man who honours God and obeys him. You can almost hear Naomi's hard, bitter heart towards God softening here, can't you? Oh, he's not forgotten me. I'm not as empty as I thought. God always provides for his people. He always keeps his promises. Well, Ruth tells Naomi that Boaz has told her to come back every day until the end of the harvest. And unsurprisingly, Naomi agrees. And the chapter ends with Ruth going back to glean until the harvest is ended and staying there living with Naomi. And so from one angle, Ruth and Naomi seem sorted now, right? Job done. God's looked after these women. So why is there any more of the book of Ruth? Well, it's because there's another cliffhanger here. You see, harvest time doesn't last forever, probably about 12 weeks or so. What about after the harvest ends? What next for these women? Well, we'll see the beginning of that, the answer to that question next week. And it's a lovely story. It's brilliantly written. There's loads of drama and all that. But so what? What has all of this got to do with us living many thousands of years after it? What are we meant to make of all of this? Well, I think there are 3 things that Ruth 2 calls all of us to remember as a result of the events of the lives of these people. 3 things to remember. First of all, remember the perspective faith gives. Remember the perspective faith gives. I'm currently reading the Harry Potter books to Aoife. If you're new to Avenue, Harry Potter is kind of like my version of other preachers' C.S. Lewis. So a lot of other preachers will quote C.S. Lewis all the time. I tend to always have a Harry Potter reference I could use most weeks. I don't, but I could. This week I am. Anyway, I'm reading them to Aoife and to Jamie. And one of the best things about doing this is that I know how it all ends. I know which little details are going to be significant and which characters are going to be important in the end. And it is adding an extra layer to me as I read them, because I can see what the author's doing as you go through the story. However, Aoife, she's not read them before. And so as well as enjoying them, she's also finding them really frustrating. There have been so many occasions when we've finished reading for an evening and she's begged me to tell her what's going to happen to that character, what happens next, how that problem is solved. Breakfast times, asking me questions about what we've read the night before. But I don't want to ruin it for her. It's the right way to enjoy the story, even if it's frustrating for her. You see, there are 2 perspectives going on. Aoife is very much reading the books from the point of view of the characters. She's in the story. She's feeling the story and the frustrations and pains of the stories, being kept in the dark when the people in the stories are kept in the dark. But from my perspective, I get the author's perspective. I know the ending while we're in the middle of it all. I can see what the author's doing. And in Ruth 2, the writer uses lashings of sarcasm to help us see these 2 perspectives in the events of these women's lives. In fact, they start doing that at the end of chapter 1, where Ruth and Naomi just happen to return to Bethlehem as the harvest begins. In chapter 2, Ruth just happens to end up in Boaz's field. Boaz just happens to arrive at the field on her first day there. He also happens to have heard about Ruth already. And he also happens to be a relative who's in prime position to offer protection to Ruth and Naomi long term. Do you see all those coincidences? Do you see the sarcasm the author of this book is using? The author knows that there is a sovereign God working behind the scenes, the real author of the story, working all things together, unseen, unacknowledged even throughout the book of Ruth. But he's there nonetheless. And the truth is that in all of our lives, we're always in the story. And the story hurts. The story can be frustrating. The story can be horrible and can really drag on. But Ruth 2 calls us all to remember the perspective on our lives that faith in a good and sovereign God gives each and every one of us. Calls us to remember the perspective faith gives. When our lives feel chaotic, out of control, painful and rubbish, we need to remember that above it all is a sovereign God sovereignly working every moment of our lives, even the painful parts, for our ultimate good and for his purpose and his glory. And I need you to remind me of that. And we need each other to remind each other of that. This is really comforting if you're at school or at college, particularly at the moment. See, in your life, everyone is telling you what to do all the time. You've got very little control over your own lives. Things happen to you, just like things happen to Ruth a lot in this book. But remembering the truth that behind all of those happenings is a good and sovereign God who loves you and cares for you and is actually in charge, more than your mum, dad, teachers or the government, well, that can be a huge comfort when life feels out of your own control. And that is the perspective that faith in a good God gives. And we all need this perspective to be able to keep going in the story. We all need reminding of it often. I recently heard the Christian life described as a constant cycle of amnesia and deja vu. Basically, I forgot that I've learned that already. And so the stuff that we have learned already, we're going to need to be reminded of. And none more than the fact that we can trust our good and sovereign God, the author of the story, whose plans we might never understand and see until the very end. We need to remember to trust that in the middle of the story. The Puritan pastor and writer John Flavel says it like this: "The providence of God is like Hebrew words. It can be read only backwards." The providence of God is like Hebrew words. It can be read only backwards. We might never get the answer we want in the timescale we want it, but we can be sure that we always have a good God we can trust no matter what. And so when we're in the story, we need to remember the perspective faith gives, the truth that there is a sovereign God working unseen behind the scenes for our good and his glory, no matter what. Remember the perspective faith gives. But the second thing Ruth 2 reminds us is to remember the practice faith results in. Remember the practice faith results in. See, in Ruth, in fact, in the whole Bible, Boaz massively stands out because he's a man who does what God says. And that's seen by how he treats people in Ruth chapter 2. And he's a challenge to us all that our faith in God is not shown by how good our theology is, how many books we've read, how much we serve at church, how long we've been a Christian. No, true faith in God is shown by how we love and care for others, how we put our faith into practice. Particularly, how we care for those more vulnerable than we are. True faith in God is seen clearest in how we care for each other and for the vulnerable around us. Boaz sacrifices his own comfort and profit so that he can care for Ruth. And he treats Ruth as an equal because he knows that in God's eyes, he's just as undeserving of the things he's received as she is. He's a clear reminder that true faith in God is seen most clearly in how we love others, in how generous we are to others, even if they can't pay us back. So how are we loving each other? Sacrificially, generously, even when it costs and even when we can't and won't be repaid. Do we spend time with each other waiting for others to serve us? Or do we come to our times with other Christians looking for how we can serve others? You see, true faith in God is demonstrated most clearly in how we care for others. That's what Jesus said, isn't it, in John 13? "A new command I give you, love one another. As I've loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. How we love each other is a demonstration of the faith we claim to have to the world around us. Following God's laws might feel frustrating, but they are life-giving like the gleaning laws, both to us and the people who see us following them. This is how people will know we really do follow Jesus, by how we sacrificially, generously, and wholeheartedly love each other. You see, the truth is, claiming to have faith in God but refusing to love each other is not really faith at all. And Boaz is a beautiful demonstration of that, as well as a challenge to us all. How is our faith seen through our practice, both on our own and as a church family? How are we caring for the vulnerable in our society? And I don't just mean giving stuff to food banks or to clothes shelters. How are we caring for them most by getting them what they really need the most, which is the gospel? How are we demonstrating the love that Jesus has for the poor and the marginalised by how we're sharing the gospel with the poor and the needy in our city, whether that's in Ayers Monsell or Clarendon Park or anywhere? How are we doing that individually and as a church? How are we caring for those struggling in our church or in our home groups? We thought about the cost of living crisis and how we can love each other this week at family meeting. How are we doing that? How are we willing to do that as a church? If we're to be an effective witness to the world around, we need to remember the practice faith in God results in. Not because we want to look good, to show off how great our social action campaigns are at Avenue, but because it clearly demonstrates that God has recognised us as foreigners and strangers and poor and needy, and yet has given us everything we do not deserve. And so we can do that for others. We need to remember the practice faith leads to. And that leads thirdly on to remembering the places grace goes to. Remember the places grace goes to. In this book, Ruth is a foreign outsider who deserves nothing from God and his people, especially as a Moabite. And yet, God's grace and mercy is shown to her. And so this chapter reminds us that there is no one who's outside the reach of God's grace and forgiveness and care and love. Now, this might be the encouragement we need this morning when we think about our family or our friends who seem to show no interest in God at all. Those people we feel, if we're honest, who've got no hope of ever being saved. Whoever it is you're thinking of, who your heart breaks for, Ruth 2 is a reminder to us that God's grace can reach even them. No one is outside of the reach of his care and mercy and love. So keep praying. Keep talking about God. Keep showing them the love that Boaz shows here. Keep loving them and trust God for the results. But perhaps you're here this morning yourself feeling utterly unworthy, wondering how on earth God could love someone like you. Oh, Dan, you don't know the things I've done. You don't know my past. You don't know what I was doing this morning or last night. You don't know what goes around my head. You're stuck in shame and guilt and fear of people finding out just how bad you really are. God could never accept someone like you. Well, Boaz is a great example of the length of God's generosity to people who do not deserve it and should be far off from God's people. But in truth, he pales into insignificance when we compare him to the true Boaz. In fact, Boaz's descendant, we'll see in a few weeks' time, Jesus. You see, Jesus is the greatest example of the places grace goes to. All through his life on earth, he showed that time and time again as he loved, healed, forgave, and spent time with his disciples and people that everyone else rejected. Jesus went towards the lowest of the low, the people we'd all try and avoid. The worst of the worst. If you want a clear example of the places grace goes to, read through the Gospels and see who Jesus goes towards and who he spends most of his time with. His opponents knew it, his enemies knew it, and they give him, I think, my favourite nickname for Jesus as a result. They call him the friend of sinners. Oh, Jesus is the friend of sinners. His grace goes to anyone, to everyone who will come to him no matter what. And he demonstrates the place his grace goes to and the practice faith leads to by how he loves those who are completely unlovable. Which is why we can and should show the kind of abundant generosity and love that Boaz shows to the Ruths in our mind, the people we might look down on. You see, when we deserve nothing, God's grace reached us, and we can therefore show that to others. Jesus is also the perfect example of someone who always had the right perspective on things. You see, when life in the story was hard or confusing, he demonstrated this perspective through his prayers. So, for example, the night before he died, he prayed, "Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me. However, not as I will, but as you will." In the middle of his suffering, he knew God was sovereign over it all, crying out even, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He demonstrated the perspective faith gives, and all of that was for me and for you. So no matter how unworthy or unacceptable you might feel today, his grace is coming for you if you'll accept it. As John 3:16 tells us, God so loves the world that he gave his only son, that whoever, even you, whoever believes in him will not perish. You will not suffer the punishment you deserve, cut off from God for eternity, but instead can get eternal life, beginning now and carrying on till then. See, we need to remember the places grace goes to. There is no one too dirty for Jesus to wash clean, no one too sick for Jesus to heal, and no one too far away for Jesus to reach. So Ruth 2 reminds us to remember the perspective faith gives. Trusting God in the middle of the story, even when it feels like chaos. We need to remember the practice faith leads to, that we can love others sacrificially and generously as a result of the generosity we've been shown by God. And we need to remember the places grace goes to. There is no one outside the reach of God's grace. And I know that because his grace reached even me.